The 2020 Olympics was all set and ready to get into the books of history as the 32nd edition of the Games until the coronavirus pandemic broke out around the world. The Tokyo Olympics will now be remembered as the first ever to be postponed following the coronavirus outbreak that became rampant, leading into the date set for the Games. The push means both organizers and athletes will have to go back to the drawing board and try to redo their plans again, hoping for a much better Olympic experience. With confirmation of next year's Olympic dates, some countries have begun easing travel restrictions, allowing for a partial return of sporting activities. In Africa, the long road to the qualification still awaits many prospective Olympians across the continent as the countdown to the Games continues.
The postponed Olympic Games are set to start officially in Japan on Friday, July 23, 2021, making the country a second-time host of the Summer Games. This will come after a long period of sportsmen and women being on hold as everyone tried to come to terms and survive the pandemic. African countries have been hugely affected, with the majority of sporting activities yet to resume the usual routines, meaning there will be a delay for return to practice in some regions. In South Africa, the men's national hockey team has already resumed training, with the coach hoping his team of young players will be in a position to compete against other seasoned veterans come next year.
It's been tough. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that the Olympics has been postponed, I think globally obviously a bad thing. But perhaps for us, in terms of a little bit more maturity and a bit more prep, you know, we'll take it. From a point of view of hockey, I think probably some guys is the longest break they've had in years, which is a good thing.
In Kenya, qualified teams like the rugby sevens teams, boxing and volleyball, news from the Ministry of Sports on the return formula will be a boost for their morale as they look to start early Olympic preparations.
So many people are not going to come back the same way they left. So those are things that we'll need to work on. And also looking at the time now, the time is moving, the time is running very fast for us. So we'll have to combine like our fitness and our skill level, our defense pattern, our structures, like we'll need to put them in place. And also maybe to get few games to bring us back to the same mentality we had before COVID-19.
To help cushion the different organizations, in May, International Olympic Committee Chairman Thomas Bach released an $800 million aid envelope. $650 million of the money is said to cover the cost of postponement of the Games for a year, with the remaining $150 million set to be allocated to international federations, national Olympic committees and approved athletes who have seen their cash flow dry up following the global suspension of sports.
This crisis has very severe financial effects on the world, on society, on governments, and so of course also on the Olympic Games, the entire Olympic movement, and in particular the IOC in this respect. So we have been discussing these financial effects, this financial impact today. You can imagine that this is not easy because planning in these days is so difficult because of all the uncertainties you have. Nobody knows how the world looks like tomorrow.
As the pandemic curve continues to flatten, more and more athletes will be looking forward to an ease on the restrictions so as to have even more time to sharpen their skills on different areas, even as the news of Olympic dates get closer by the day. Chamwono, CGTN.
All right, we continue our discussion on the upcoming Tokyo Olympics, and it is my pleasure to invite Manfred Seidler, an athletics journalist from Johannesburg, to tonight's show. Manfred, thank you for joining us here on Sports Scene. Welcome. And to start us off, are you convinced we shall have an Olympics next year as scheduled? Manfred?
Good evening, Richard. Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I don't think anybody actually even knows. I mean, in principle, the IOC has to, and Tokyo have to prepare as if it's going to happen. But I mean, noises coming out of Tokyo, I'm pretty sure you're aware of, have been saying that if there's no vaccine, chances of the games actually happening are pretty slim. So obviously there's a huge rush to get this vaccine, not just from a sporting point of view, but from a global point of view out there. But if you just look at the money that's been spent on the Olympics to date, anything between 12 and 22 billion, depending on which source you look at. But 12 billion US dollars in itself is a monumental amount of money. That's just in Tokyo itself. Now the IOC makes huge amount of money through television rights, marketing, ticket sales, sponsorship sales. Now they've had to postpone it for another year, which is becoming a problem because the sponsorships work in Olympic cycles. So every 4 years, the sponsorship may change. Now what you're finding is that some sponsors are overlapping. They're starting their cycle from 2021, the new sponsors, but the old sponsors still have to carry on. So it's a bit of a nightmare from that point of view. And I don't think anyone really has the answers. I think we're all hoping the Olympics will go ahead. But it's going to be a huge challenge. I mean, how Tokyo is going to handle the quarantine issue. You've got 10,000 athletes coming in with their entire entourage. And of course, all the spectators, tourists, and so on and so forth. It's a logistical nightmare. I don't think anyone actually has the answers to that.
Wow, Manfred, thank you for your enlightening points. But based on your rich experience, what is going through the minds of athletes after being forced to wait for a further year for the next Olympics?
Well, that's an interesting one. I was listening to your insert just before that, and the South African hockey team are going, that's great, you've got an extra year to prepare, mature, and so on and so forth. For other athletes, it's the complete opposite. Athletes coming to the end of their career going like, take a Justin Gatlin, for example, the United States 100-meter sprinter, the world champion. He's coming to the end of his career. He's literally, you could say, on his last legs. That extra year might actually come back to bite him. So it really, I suppose, depends on which athlete you're talking to, which sporting code you're talking to. A lot of the South African track and field athletes have written this year off because they only were able to start training 3 weeks ago, back onto university facilities. So they've written the season off, and they're basically only going to start training. Well, they'll do a proper winter training, which will be good for them, which means they'll be fresher, stronger going forward for 2021. So I suppose it depends on the sporting code, how each athlete's going to motivate themselves. Initially, obviously, the athletes were completely devastated for obvious reasons. But I mean, if you look at what's happening in global sport, Tour de France has kicked off today. The US Open is starting. We're seeing London Marathon as a elite race happening. Events are starting to happen. And if you look at the athletics scene, I mean, records have been falling. Joshua Cheptegei coming out of training, no racing, comes and breaks the 16-year-old world record on the 5,000 meters of Kenenisa Bekele. So I suppose it really depends on each individual athlete and each sporting code, how they've stayed motivated or remotivated themselves. But the initial impact would have been huge because everyone was in limbo. And then it really depended on different regions, how they opened up. I mean, the United States pretty much didn't shut down at all, if you really look at it. So they would have carried on with business as usual. But in South Africa, everything literally just shut down, and you lost 2 months, which could be quite devastating. So it's a challenge, that one. But I think the athletes they're always taking on challenges. They always need to be preparing, and a big part of it, of course, is the mental side of it. And this, I would imagine, would have made a lot of athletes a lot stronger.
All right, Manfred Seidler, I'd like to thank you for your expertise on this matter and sharing your insights with us. For me, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and hope that the Olympics do happen.